very much, Martin, and I'm glad so many people could make it today, given the rather apocalyptic skies outside. But anyway, welcome to the Urban Humanitarian Conference. I'm really delighted to chair this unique platform, which is bringing together humanitarians and the private sector in an effort to build resilience and effective response in urban emergencies. And this event aims to give you, as members from both sectors, the opportunity to share experiences, and I think you've been doing some of that in advance of the panel, which is nice to hear, learn from successful initiatives, and also address common challenges and strengthen your networks. And this is all with a view to moving closer to establishing best practice, or let's say good practice, in the increasingly important field of humanitarian response in urban emergencies. And as we all know, humanitarian crises are increasingly affecting urban contexts, either directly through civil conflict and urban violence, through hazards such as flooding, earthquakes, or outbreaks of disease such as Ebola, or indirectly through hosting people affected by these various threats. 20 or 30 years ago, when some of us started, I'm not going to admit to exactly when that was, the majority of humanitarian response took place in rural or camp-based settings. Now, the focus has shifted, and over 60% of refugees and 80% of IDPs live in urban areas. These are really sobering figures, because I think even a few years ago, we never would have thought that that would be the case. But I think the humanitarian sector has been a bit slow to understand how working in urban spaces necessitates changes in how they actually operate. Although this is changing, as you're going to hear when our panelists present. For agencies that are used to working in rural contexts, the dynamism of the city, the multiplicity of stakeholders, and the complexity of the relationships, I think, are particular challenges. And I think sometimes humanitarian agencies also lack the technical, the skills, the technical capacity, and financial resources necessary to respond effectively in these environments. I think Redar has pointed out in the blurb on their Urban Humanitarian course that the resources that humanitarians have are often dwarfed by those that the private sector can bring. And I think this is why building relationships with national and municipal authorities as well as private sector actors is so very important, in addition to the ones that we traditionally want to have with community members or affected people. So Redar has been working to facilitate collaboration between the humanitarian and private sectors on the response to urban crises since 2013 through phases 1 and 2 of the Ready to Respond program, which is funded by Lloyd's Charities Trust, the grant-making charity of the Lloyd's insurance market, our host today. As such, Redar is uniquely placed to bring together the urban practitioners from both communities. Ready to Respond, as I said, began in 2013 in response to growing global urbanization and the challenges of disaster response in urban settings. With the support of the Lloyd's Charity Trust, the Ready to Respond Phase 2 program, which runs until 2019, aims to increase the ability of over 2,000 individuals and organizations involved in humanitarian action to prepare for and respond to emergencies, particularly in urban centers. A major aspect of the project is the provision of technical support and harnessing of private sector expertise, which is provided by 4 primary activities. So firstly, Redar is continuing to develop Knowledge Point, which is the online technical support service for aid workers around the world. In 2016, Knowledge Point was accessed 3,240 times from 196 countries. That's 3 more countries than the member states who signed the New York Declaration last September on refugees and migrants. And recently, the Global WASH Cluster has promoted Knowledge Point as their online technical support service. Secondly, Redar has updated its training to reflect the need to build urban capacity. New courses include an introduction to humanitarianism in urban settings, which aims to prepare private sector professionals for potential deployment to urban emergencies. And the next course is being run later this year, and Isaac has details of these at the back. Isaac, where are you? There he is. He's sort of to the side. If you'd like to pick these up later as you leave. And a third activity has been the successful mentoring program, matching humanitarian mentors with private sector mentees and vice versa. And so former mentees include people who coordinate water, sanitation, and hygiene activities globally for all UN agencies, international donors, and NGOs, and who are responsible for projects that benefit millions of people affected by disaster. And finally, with a long-standing connection to the commercial world, Red R is helping to foster collaboration between humanitarians and the private sector. This conference is part of that agenda, as is the launch of the Urban Hub, which we're going to hear more about later from Jez. So this evening, we're going to showcase 3 examples of collaboration between the humanitarian and private sectors. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists. So on my right is Tom Newby, who's the head of humanitarian. Is there something missing, or just the head of humanitarian? Okay, he's just the head of humanitarian at CARE International UK. And he's going to draw on CARE's partnership with BuroHappold in Mozambique. And he'll be supported by Matthew Duckett. Matthew, where are you?
Yep.
Okay. And Sam Udon, who's there, both structural engineers from BuroHappold. And then secondly is Anne Mahony, who's Director of Concern Worldwide. And she's going to share lessons learned from Concern's work in Lebanon. And the weather in Ireland today, you thought it was only bad here, has provided the airlines with some challenges. So Anne's going to be joining us remotely. Are you there, Anne? She's muted, okay. Okay, and I've known Anne for a very long time, so I hope she's there. And then, thirdly, we have Darren Gill, who's a senior consultant from Arup International Development. He's going to be presenting learning from Arup's project in Nepal, working with NSET, which is, I believe, the National Society for Earthquake Technology, for those of you who aren't very good with acronyms, like me. And yes, so, and then after that, this afternoon, we're also going to have the official launch of the Urban Hub. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, this aims to connect the private sector experts with NGOs in need of emergency technical support in urban disasters. And Jeremy, or do you prefer to be called Jez? Jez Foster, a director of Ramboll, will provide an introduction to this initiative that is being supported by many of the private sector organizations represented here tonight. So we're hoping to finish with time for questions and answers, about 30 minutes, if we keep to time, and conclude by about 6:30 p.m. so we can have further networking and discussions at the pub. So without further ado, can I hand over to Tom? And I think
okay.
We'll have our speakers go to the podium, and I'm the only one that gets the luxury of staying at the table.
So there are 3 of us speaking, so we'll do a bit of a tag team. But, I'm going to give a quick overview of what we were doing, and from CARE's point of view, and then we're going to hand the floor to Sam and Matthew, who actually did all the work on this BuroHappold. But this is a collaboration on the response to Cyclone Dinieo in Mozambique between BuroHappold and CARE. Can I use this? So it was a not very widely publicised disaster. Cyclone Dinieo hit Mozambique on the 15th of February. And it was around 20,000 homes that were destroyed, approximately 130,000 people affected. That's reasonably large numbers, but in the scale of things that have been going on this year, was a pretty small emergency. It didn't get much attention. But I think the key thing is that responding to disasters of this kind of scale is the large majority of the impact that organisations like CARE have. The very big ones might make the news and get large amounts of money and have projects like this, but actually it's all the small ones and the medium-sized emergencies where the largest numbers of people are affected, and where organisations like CARE have a major role to play. And I should say, this is not a very urban project. There were some areas that might qualify as urban, but generally it's a rural project. But we're going to look at the collaboration between private sector and NGO. So the response was pretty standard emergency response: food, basic relief items, emergency shelter. You see some photos here of things being distributed. And we deployed from here in the UK a shelter specialist to go and support the team there on what they should be doing with the reconstruction. And it became clear fairly quickly that the gap that really needed filling was supporting the government with and some of the donors, UNICEF being one of them, that to rebuild the roofs on schools and health centres that have been damaged or destroyed. Now, the standard NGO way to respond to this is to get a structural engineer, go and send them out, work with the team there, do some design work, and start constructing this. We struggled here. We couldn't find a Portuguese speaker. We couldn't find someone who was available at the right time. This year has been extraordinarily busy with emergency responses, and all of our kind of go-to people that we rely on just weren't available. And so we thought, we'll quickly see if we can get this support from the private sector in the UK. Now, I think in the ideal world, we would get this work from the private sector in Mozambique or in the region. Because of the speed that we needed to work at, we were working with some 6-month contracts, so we really had very little time to do this. And this is a project where we were effectively doing permanent reconstruction on emergency timescales with emergency money. So we went where we knew, and did a rapid tender process to get engineering support in the UK. We reached out to a few companies, asked them to quote, and had a discussion about what they could do, and ended up appointing BuroHappold. So I'm going to talk about how we ended up working and what we did, and the limitations of what we did. The intention, because of this short time period, was to get procurement and construction underway really very quickly, without compromising on the design standards. Now, NGOs like CARE have been involved in lots of projects in the past where you get procurement underway and you worry about the design while you're procuring, and then it turns into a total nightmare. So we didn't want to repeat that experience. To do this well, we needed an organisation with the ability to go and visit the project locations. We couldn't do this whole thing remotely. The ability to work flexibly, because we knew that the context was continually changing, but that what we put in the brief scope at the beginning was not going to be the same as what actually ended up needing to be done. And most of all, we only had a budget of £10,000. We'd scraped this together. We had no institutional funding for this. This happily came at the end of our financial year, so we managed to get £10,000 together from our unrestricted budget that we could put towards this. And lastly, we needed the documentation to be Portuguese. Now, we chose BuroHappold because it was clear that they had a setup that allowed them to be flexible and very responsive. And Sam and Matthew will talk about this a bit later. And we had quite a few discussions about how we would structure this, and that really to keep within a very limited budget, which in the end BuroHappold were able to supplement with some programming time, was only done when CARE gave confirmation to proceed. So we had a field visit. Matthew went out, did the necessary upfront work, but none of the actual documentation was produced until there was a definite go-ahead that this particular building was going to be done. And that kept the workload under control and avoided repeating work, which is a common problem with engineering, outsourcing the engineering in a rapidly changing environment, that you get work to be done that then ends up not being relevant. You have to have someone who can do it. CARE UK, my team, played a pretty minor role in the end. We contracted BuroHappold, but really just making sure that there was understanding between CARE Mozambique and BuroHappold about what was needed and what was a reasonable expectation and what could be done within the scope and within this budget, and agreeing really what was critical. But changes over the response and gaps in CARE's staffing in Mozambique and in the UK actually meant there was quite a lot of potential confusion and some actual confusion. So not surprisingly, there were quite a few areas where we had to go back and forth quite a bit and make sure that everything was clear. donors changed the goalposts somewhat. So the scope of work got expanded by the donors. The agency we were working with started off being UNICEF and ended up being UN Habitat. We had different bits of money, some from office, some from other places. Trying to bring this together in a project without ending up changing BuroHappold's scope significantly was really quite a challenge. And that affected what finally was done, but nonetheless what we agreed was that BuroHappold would provide a basic level of design information. They'd do the primary structural calculations, they would provide enough information to procure, and then provide typical details. Now, the assumption was that there would be local contractors who would be able to interpret those typical details. The reality, perhaps not unsurprisingly, was that didn't prove to be the case, so UN Habitat ended up doing a secondary detailed design stage. So as with often these things, you have to do extra work to get to the point. I should note, we plan actually to go out and do a review of how this went in Mozambique. Because for the moment, this information is what we've got through exchanging emails and a couple of Skype calls back and forth with Care Mozambique. We actually want to go and understand exactly how this did work, didn't work, and where these changes came from, because we want to know whether this is the best way to do this again in the future. What we think, and I'll let Darren will talk about this, but this actually led to some very significant savings and costs to the donors on the delivery of these projects. And the key thing is the approach really did achieve its main objective of delivering a rigorous structural design and getting procurement and construction underway in this very short project, and doing it to a reasonably good standard. So I've just put a bit of feedback here from our project manager in Care Mozambique. English is not his first language, so some of it's slightly weird phrasing, but that the key things here, the prompt response and deployments. So both our internal deployments, but then getting BuroHappold on board very quickly, critical to show the capacity and the ability to do professional work, unlocked additional support from other agencies like UN Habitat. The quality of the design work, and here we're saying, so when UN Habitat came on board, the standards, and some of these were standards of finishes rather than structural standards, so there are some slightly, but effectively moving the goalposts is what I was talking about. Really introduced the sense of an international standard of structural design in an area that was not expecting it, and we had some back and forth at the beginning also with UNICEF saying we should be reconstructing these roofs to a durable, rigorous standard and not doing an emergency response here. So this was really trying to bypass doing everything twice. Was quite a challenge, but it does seem that the approach of bringing in serious structural engineering meant that the expectations of standards went up and the actual standard of construction was higher than it would have been if we hadn't done so. And lastly, here, that it really meant things went faster. So there are lots of responses where you want to do things like this and you end up doing, the actual construction ends up not happening for 18 months, 2 years sometimes. This all went very quickly and meant that the roof reconstruction can really get underway very quickly. So that's kind of a background from the positives and some of the difficulties that we saw from CARE's point of view. I'll hand over now to Sam and Matthew so they can talk about what they did, what BuroHappold's point of view was, and they'll also give you a bit more detail of what they actually delivered, to put a bit more flesh on the bones of what the project was. So,
thanks, Tom.
Brilliant, cheers Tom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the BuroHappold perspective and how we delivered the project. So as Tom was saying, what was quite critical from CARE's perspective was that this was completed quickly. CARE were looking to get structural information as well in terms of repair strategies for 100 classrooms and 4 health centres, as well as bill of quantity information. And this is so they can kind of communicate, talk about funding with donors. As I mentioned, our scope of works was 100 classrooms and 4 health centres. There's quite a variety in terms of the actual design of the buildings, particularly with the health centres. These weren't kind of just standard buildings that were kind of rolled out across Mozambique. The schools themselves tended to be the masonry structures with timber roofs, but the health centres were much more varied in terms of design. Got an image of a steel on the bottom right there. CARE contacted us. The design was to happen mid-February. CARE spoke to us around early March. We were brought on board to get information, and then I went on a field visit kind of early April to gather information from SIDA, such as building dimensions, assess the level of damage and extent of damage to the different structures, and then brought that back to a team of 9 of us who were in the UK to produce these repair strategies. And now what was quite important that these were kind of high-level construction, high-level repair strategies, not kind of construction information. And we produced these in both English and Portuguese, as well as a set of a details document, which was a set of typical details for construction details that were typically made poorly out there, that we wanted to provide robust solutions to. So an example of this was the connection between trusses and blockwork walls, for example. That's where a lot of the failures had occurred. And we were able to produce this in accordance with the Mozambican guide for cyclone-proof schools, as well as local engineers there. So CARE were working with a team of local engineers who were going to oversee the work, and we were able to produce these details with them to get a kind of good understanding of availability of local materials and what they felt that contractors would be quite comfortable to construct there. As well as that, because they were overseeing the work, so I was able to work with them to kind of explain the guiding principles behind our designs, because we know that when these things get sent to site, sometimes they get there are design changes that have to occur, and we wanted the guys overseeing the work to have a good understanding of where we were coming from with our designs. And so, looking at the implementation, BuroHappold have a pool of people called the International Development Community, and that's people like myself and Sam who are happy to give time to projects like these. And now this one was, I wouldn't say more unique, but it was slightly different. BuroHappold were able to give us a pot of money with which we could kind of book time to, and we were able to get a kind of much larger team from this development community to be able to work on the project. And you can see that there's quite a range of disciplines. It was a multidisciplinary team, a range of grades and a range of locations. So, for example, we had a senior structural engineer in New York, as well as an engineering technician from the mechanical team in Bath. And so what this allowed was it gave us a much larger kind of skill pool to be able to get resource from. Now, and it led to us being able to do things like deliver the translations in Portuguese, which weren't actually part of the initial scope. Because we had this large team, we were able to subdivide well enough to be able to produce these repair strategies quite quickly. So if you look at the programme at the bottom there, you can see the 3 districts of all of the classrooms were produced within a month of the return of my return from Mozambique. So we were able to produce this information quite quickly, and ultimately CARE were able to go to tender within 5 months of the disaster and start construction within 6. And so this is where we are now. Construction's underway in all 3 districts for all of the classrooms. And so, looking at the collaboration, BuroHappold and CARE were the first organisations to deal with large-scale resilient roof rehabilitation within Mozambique. We were able to act fast Because CARE had existing infrastructure within country, they're already talking with local governments about which districts to target, which schools and which health centres to target as well. Our kind of specific targeted engineering response at the right time allowed for CARE to get quick cost estimates as to how much it will be to complete the project, as well as the quick repair information. And what we did a calculation looking at the amount of material that we were able to save from having this kind of targeted engineering approach, and it's in the region of $150,000. It's the savings on purely materials that we were able to look at and say those roof trusses, for example, are okay to be reused. What also was really helpful was that Tom and CARE had a very good understanding of what was realistic for BuroHappold to be able to produce. So they knew that it would be inefficient for us to produce construction information that would either get ruled out when it got to Mozambique, or it would frankly take us too long to be able to do that. So there was very realistic expectations from us. As Tom mentioned at the start, there was a bit of, because we were going from a kind of initial response to a more protracted response, there was a changeover in the local team there, which kind of led to a small breakdown of communication and kind of understanding what BuroHappold were there to do. So that was the only real challenge that we faced, but I think that's kind of quite natural, really. Yes, I think that's me, so I'm going to hand over to Sam.
Thanks, Matthew. Yes, Sam, very quickly.
Yeah, one slide. Just been asked to sum up what BuroHappold and the private sector can bring to a project like this. So as we mentioned, we have a share our skills scheme in BuroHappold, which allows us to provide 200 person days to pro bono projects. So there's a process that people go through. They have to sit in a dragon's den with partners and pitch their ideas. So we were fortunate enough to get funding to support the amount that Tom was able to contribute to the project. So between the two sources of funding, we were able to deal with this. It always fills me with a lot of sort of, well, a warm glow really. Whenever we get our new graduates, there's so much enthusiasm that comes in at the bottom of our organisation around this time of year, which is coupled with a breadth and depth of expertise that exists throughout the business. So one of our directors was involved in Somalia and Liberia a couple of decades ago, all the way through to a lot of our new graduates that worked at university and want to get involved in this sector. So within the company, there's always a huge pool of people, talented people that want to get involved. And then I also think, as engineers, it's in our DNA. We understand how projects are built. We know sort of how these things need to progress on site. So I think that's something that is really valuable to this process. I think what we need in terms of help is the local knowledge, framework and infrastructure, both in country and also from organisations like CARE, that without, this wouldn't be possible for us to get involved in. And that's the final point, really. My partner in Tom really understands how we work, what we do, and can get the best from us to deliver a very successful project.
Brilliant, thanks very much. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. We're going to hold your questions and comments. I said earlier, Mahony from Concern Worldwide is joining us from Ireland. Anne, are you there?
Oh, hi Wendy, sorry.
Yes, it's me.
First of all, I'm really sorry that I can't be here today. We have a storm blowing at the moment, but I'm trying to work around that and flight cancelled. There's a huge echo on the line here, so I'm talking over myself a little bit. How's it coming? Okay, I'll just continue. I have a cold, so I'll try not to have a Theresa May moment and carry on regarding. And the other thing that I wanted to say, that I'm not an engineer. and I do feel a little bit at a loss speaking with a group of engineers and a wider community there. Okay, very good. So I'm just maybe a little background on who Concern is. We are an international humanitarian development NGO, and our focus is on absolute poverty. And we focus on the poorest countries in the world. And within those countries, we focus on the poorest areas. So we're quite uncompromising in terms of our. We work in 27 countries. And we focus mainly on primary health care, which is what? Primary education, livelihood and resilience. We have over 3,000 staff, a mixture of direct and indirect activity. I wanted to say specifically about in Lebanon. We began work in Lebanon in response to the Syrian refugee crisis around 2000. We found it quite hard, I suppose, to look for entry points as it was quite a difficult place to get purchased into. One of the contracts in very early days that we brought as an opportunity to engage in was to look at an extension of the sewage system in a few villages in Mashta Hamoud in northern Lebanon. And this was primarily, the focus was to put in a sewage system in an area which had been damaged during the Civil War back in the mid-80s and hadn't been repaired since then. And number two, to make a more welcoming environment for the hundreds of thousands of refugees that were coming into the area as a result of the Syrian conflict. We have, up to now, completed about 25 small wash infrastructure projects in Lebanon. But this for us was by far the biggest one. It was €4.5 million, focusing specifically on Mashta Hamoud and two villages around Mashta Hamoud. It started off with one village, and then it was extended to the neighbouring village. And as you can see from the photographs there, it was a lot of excavation, it was a lot of pipe laying. We put it out to tender, and a local contractor, Hassan, bid for it, and he won the winning bid, and we gave him the contract. It has had a lot of implementation issues. There were start delays, there were issues around land ownership and laying pipes to people's lands. There was issues in terms of the municipal responsibility. Ultimately, the system was owned by the municipality, and Concern was implementing it on behalf of the municipality. Once this contract ends, we have a one-year maintenance and an operational contract to ensure that everything is working properly. I thought part of it all was, and I put in a few photographs just to show a little bit the scale and the scope. Keeping in mind that up to now, Concern wash interventions have been around spring protection, have been around gravity-fed systems, have been around building latrines and much smaller, more manageable interventions. So this for us was quite big. It's not the biggest engineering project we've ever undertaken, but it is certainly the most sophisticated. And I suppose it made me think that there's no way that an organisation like Concern would take on the development and rollout of the sewage system in Ireland in any size of a village. And therefore, why would we even attempt this with Lebanon? And it made me conclude that actually, this really isn't a role for it. We've had difficulties with staffing. Our salary scale indicates that we don't get enough dollar for engineers or that level of I suppose, expertise that's required. We've had relationship management with rural farmers, with the municipality, with contractors and subcontractors. And we've had issues with it. We haven't yet had it overrun, but it's quite possible. If we were to do it all again, would we? I think no. Already pulled out of a much bigger contract that we were supposed to take lead in, given our experience in food. But I suppose further, I don't think this is the best way of using non-profit. I think we're very good at communities, at participation, at looking at rights, at looking at better ways of working. But in terms of taking on an engineer that size, I don't think it is really the best use of the non-government organisation. I suppose one of the things that we looked at in recent time, and was primarily, I suppose, my experience in that move, was looking at how we can engage with organisations like McDonald. We have signed a small pilot with McDonald to look at technical support for smaller modular projects in some of our countries. And depending on how that works, I think it could be a way forward how we engage these types of projects. Do we have a role in urban slums as humanitarian? Yes, we absolutely do. We have a role around social. We have a role around market engagement. We have a role in the, I suppose, social programming of health, education, and nutrition. We've got a much wider role, but a role in hard into projects, for sure. But I'm more than to be contributing on that. I hope you've been able to pick what I've said. For me, it's not working that well. It's almost like trying to do this from Mogadishu. Or maybe not Mogadishu today because the office is a bit destroyed during the bomb over the weekend. But maybe from another location. But I hope you were able to hear me. If any questions, I'll try and address them. But thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anne. Yes, I think we got most of what you said, and a very interesting presentation it was. And I hope you're feeling better soon, and that you're all well protected there from the effects of the storm. We're going to move on to our next speaker, and we're saving questions and comments until the last, so I hope you can stay with us. Okay, our third speaker is Darren Gill, who's over here on my far left, who's already been introduced. He's a senior consultant from Arup International Development, so he's going to be talking, as I said earlier, about Arup's project in Nepal, working with NSET. Welcome.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Harry, for the invitation, and particularly for her honesty all the way from my hometown of Dublin. I was asked by Harry and others to give an example of some of the work that Arup has been involved with in collaboration with NGOs in urban humanitarian response, and we batted around various ideas and decided to settle on this one, which is the work we did in Nepal. It was part of a structural integrity and damage assessment process that went on for quite a few months. I stress that this is not quite the same kind of binary relationship that CARE and BuroHappold had. There was a lot more actors involved in this. There were 7 private firms, including Arup, and 6 Nepalese private firms. There was a range of NGOs, including NSET, and there was a convening authority paid by the World Bank, and ultimately it was all for the Department of Education in Nepal. So I'm going to talk about it from Arup's perspective, which is just one voice on how that relationship went, and it's kind of our take on it. We are currently writing this up with the World Bank, so I've had to kind of cobble together a few different perspectives from different teams across the company to try and get a sense of it. I was asked specifically to talk about the relationships. How did this work? What were the characteristics of those relationships? What went well and what didn't? And I'm going to focus on that, but where do I go for the next slide? This one. To give one little quick sense of, well, why were we doing this? Because I think that's important. This was Nepal in 2015. A range of earthquakes hit the country. There are many different ways in which the impact of that can be calculated. These are just two that I brought forward that are relevant for the work in relation to schools in Nepal that this relates to. 20,000 classrooms destroyed, 12,000 heavily damaged. Earthquake was on a Saturday, so kids weren't in school. Monday morning, 870,000 kids weren't able to go to school. If they'd maybe been in school when the earthquake hit, we might have a slightly different story to tell. That's why we were doing this stuff. Do I control this or not? Okay, all right. Briefly on what we actually did, which is not the focus of this talk, but briefly on what we did. There was an information vacuum immediately after the earthquake about how many schools existed, where they were, what condition they were in, what needed to be done to fix them. How do you do that? How do you figure out what that gap is? How do you fill that vacuum? We were part of a team that was put together, as I said, 7 private companies, a variety of NGOs, including NSET, the World Bank and the Department of Education, to come up with an app. It sounds kind of bizarre that, well, what do? You develop an app. We developed an app. How would you go out at scale and assess the conditions of all of these schools around the damage affected area? We conducted an initial pilot to see, well, okay, how can this thing work? How successful will it be? Where are the gaps? Where are the mistakes? Where do people not understand it? We went and trained 130 engineers, training of trainers, 70 from, I never remember if it's 60 or 70, 70 from private firms in Nepal, and then 60 from the Department of Education, so that hopefully this might actually roll out as part of their national strategy. Those surveying teams went out and surveyed 6,000 schools, which is, to put it in context, there's 35,000 public and private schools across the country in Nepal. There are 6,000 public schools in the damage-affected area. We effectively surveyed all of them, and to understand what's actually there, what condition they're in, what you do about it. That feeds into a much longer process, but that's fundamentally what was done in all of this. I wanted to focus on how. How did the relationships work? Not how did we do this, but how did the relationship work? And I'm trying to pull out a few traits of this. The first has already been alluded to as Tom was discussing about, how do you get people in quickly. The key thing that was allowed these relationships to work was they were prepared. Arup had an ongoing relationship with the World Bank as part of their global program for safer schools since 2013. There's flexibility built into that framework agreement that basically says we will provide resources if and when called upon. It so happens that as this was happening, the response of Vanuatu was happening at basically exactly the same time. There was no need for contract negotiations, there was no need for tendering, there was no need for any of that. It's built into an existing contract agreement that we have, which allows us to kind of start a bit faster. In addition to that, there was some work that we'd already done with the World Bank and with others on how do you go about doing these types of things. If you were to think about it beforehand, what would you do? And these are just 2 examples of things that we produced to kind of help to set the scene for how you interact with people, who the stakeholders are, and what you need to do. The key part of that, as well as that pre-existing relationship between the World Bank and Arup, was a pre-existing relationship between Arup and NSET. That goes back nearly decades at this point, and is ongoing. We continue to do work with NSET, and we really enjoy doing work with NSET. So that really helps in terms of that relationship building. Another kind of key trait of this relationship was a collaborative one. There was a very common purpose amongst the team who was involved in this on all sides, at least from Arup's perspective. We all thought there was a common purpose. What we were doing was just the first part of this, the SIDA part, and that leads into an investment plan, and that leads into integrated management, so that the DOE actually know what the hell's going on in the future and how to manage their stock. So what we were doing was just a small part of a much, much bigger story, and there was a clear sense in the team of what that was, and that the scale of the problem and the solution was vastly bigger than what we could actually do by ourselves. So there was kind of a clear sense of, well, we can't actually, scope can't do too much because we simply can't do it. We need other people to do this with us. It has made it much harder for us as a company to say, well, what part of it did we do, and how does that work? And so we've kind of tried to think about this from the point of view of contribution rather than attribution. We contributed to this. We can't really put definitive lines around what we got from it, but we put in a small way to it. Next slide, please. Another kind of characteristic of these relationships was this idea of calibration. How do you take the analysis that you're doing and make it relevant at a level that's comparative to other places? So there was considerable amount of work done in calibrating. What does that mean? The structural typologies that were being analysed here were benchmarked into a kind of an international library of structural typologies, which the World Bank and others have developed, so that the information in this could be compared to other regions and the learning could transfer across. So you've got this calibration at the international level. Then you also have calibration right down at the basic level, where NSET in particular comes in because they've got decades of experience understanding structural typologies amongst the school building stock in Nepal. So you've got that calibration feeding in to the relationship. You also have a data management kind of part of this calibration and allowing, there was a company called Kathmandu Living Lab, or Living Lab, that built the app for the most part, and that was in an effort so that they could calibrate the way in which those data sets were coming in so that they could relate to the data sets that the DOE had and that were being established there. So there's just all this kind of calibration of things at various different scales, which we can't do all of, NSET can't do all of, nobody can do all of. The other characteristic of this relationship is the idea of standardization. The problem with all of this calibrating of things is that it leaves way too much scope for human error. And when you're trying to collect these types of data sets, the real issue is so that the different players, the 5 Nepali engineering companies who are doing surveys, the Nepali tech company that are building the app, us, the bank, all these players, that we're inputting and transferring information to each other in a standardized way, so that effectively the forms that you're using have very little scope for free text input, which just simply require the type of information that's being requested for. What the example you're seeing is simply the locations of the schools that were surveyed. So yeah, not dissimilar to Tom's example, this is not exclusively an urban thing. This was in a lot of very remote areas as well. But standardization was kind of a key part of us minimizing human error in our relationships with the people who are doing it. Not, I know, obviously I haven't gone to say it, but we're in London, this is in Nepal, so this is all in the cloud, and you need to be able to restrict how much of it can go wrong in that way. Another aspect of this was learning. We were trying to kind of cascade learning between us and the other players, and up and down and across. And so there was this whole series of training sessions which were ongoing, many of which are way beyond, I'm not an engineer, and they are way beyond my understanding of engineering, but there were deeply technical sessions, there was, just logistical organizational sessions. They were quite extensive. I think at the time people possibly thought they were a bit laborious, but there was just this huge engagement early on saying, we know we're going to have to do this, let's train and learn, make the mistakes in the pilot phase, and then hopefully roll it out after that. The idea, particularly with training the Department of Education engineers, was that so that hopefully it feeds into the kind of the national program, not just the immediate disaster affected. The other aspect of that relationship is what I was calling reflective, which is a bit of a vague term. But I was really intrigued by this approach in terms of how these companies and organizations and NGOs work together. So it was this phased approach where there's basically keying in points all the way along, that increasingly the distance and time spans out between them, where we can basically get through quality assurance. That was kind of the main aim and the main focus was how do we make sure that what's being done is actually being upheld as it goes on, and what are the feedback loops, because what was designed initially, it's like, what Tom was describing about unknown scope. That was basically our way of trying to address unknown scope, but knowing that it is going to change, and so we had these kind of feedback loops that allowed for us to kind of flexibly adapt as we went along. Which, again, I can only speak from our perspective on this. We felt that this worked very, very successfully. It allowed us to key in at different times and to make sure that the information was coming back in robustly. But I'm sure there are other people who are at the other end of those feedback loops who probably think the opposite, and I just can't speak on their behalf. Those are a few aspects. So what? Where did this lead to? Because the key thing, I think, is understanding how do those relationships move on to the next thing, and what's the value of doing it all together. A few little quick pieces. This is the ultimate thing that came out through the prioritised investment plan through the World Bank and ADB and all these other actors, which resulted in something in the order of about $6 billion worth of investment that went into, that is going in over the next few years to fix the various thousands of schools that we're talking about. It is the work that as a collaboration of private companies and NGOs and others that enable the facts to be known to be able to make those investments, so that people weren't scared off by the unknown, but we could actually document it. At a really nice relationship level, this is an EPSR research grant that we're just about to get into, which also includes NSET and Arup, who are two of the kind of non-academic institutions that are being brought into the academic world. It also involves Save the Children, who hopefully somebody from Save might be here today, I'm not sure. But it's another way of continuing that relationship, and it's building off of a lot of the work that was done in this body of work, but it's lab testing and heavy analysis that we weren't able to do in the rush that was going on in some of these things. So it's to be able to take a few years and dig even deeper into that. There are other things that came from it. We are currently in the process of trying to document the whole SIDA process so that it can be used in other places. There was no effort at the time to document it. It was more a process of actually getting it done. We're now doing that, and hopefully it can be useful for other people. And the app in particular, which I like this part of it, that it was then modified by the Kathmandu Living Lab to also deal with health centres. So they've basically done the same thing for health centres and health facilities that was done for schools, which I think is a nice kind of version of the story. So that's it. I really wanted to focus on how. I'm happy to talk a bit more about what, if that's useful for people as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. And now we have, last but not least, Jez Foster. He's the director of Ramboll, and he's going to provide an introduction to the Urban Hub.
Yes, thanks very much, Wendy. And I've got the task of actually not following just 3 fantastic talks, but just condensing my 15-minute talk into 2 minutes, I think I've got left now. But so I'm going to be launching into this, the launch itself, and this slide does in fact sum up pretty much everything. All the others, but this is essentially it. A private sector network supporting technical response to the humanitarian sector and disaster response. Now, there's been many other organisations out there, many other entities that have got together, but what I want to speak about today is really what separates us and why this is something that is significant as we're moving forward. Not least of which is the collection that we have of engineers around the table, technical response that we see there, this size of network and the scale of this. Many representatives of the steering group are in the room with us here today. I'm going to gloss over some of the backstory associated with this. I'm sure we're very familiar with it. But talking about really where we are, and crucially, where we should see ourselves moving forward as we move forward with this, as not just as a private sector, but as in conjunction with the humanitarian sector as we move forward. So, many of this is, none of this is news. 2010 World Economic Forum, there was a framework that came on the back of this, not unlike the Urban Hub, but lack of buy-in, lack of funds, prevented no real action coming off the back of this.
Sorry, care contacted us.
And then we have 4 years later on, different workshops. Again, recognising the need for engagement with the private sector, but again, no real action in terms of being seen as coming out the other side. Nothing new on this. Significant steps forward with the Lloyd's Charities Trust as we've got the Ready to Respond initiative 2014. We had put the call out to the patrons. We gathered together with humanitarian players and started bashing out some of the issues that we're facing associated with the disaster response areas that we're talking about. I'm not going to go through these, I'm going to gloss over them in detail, but really what we're talking about in how the urban hub fits into all of this is the connectivity. It's that engagement, it's that ability to bridge the gaps that we haven't seen previously. It's where we're able to go beyond pro bono support, providing that depth of response to give ourselves speedy deployment of the most appropriate people possible. So, disasters. We really need to define really what we mean by a disaster in terms of the scale of this. We're talking about large-scale disasters, urban disasters. If, God forbid, the epicenter of the earthquake in Kathmandu had been 80 kilometers closer, we wouldn't be looking at 8,000 people there, or even 80,000 people there. We'd be looking at a million-death disaster. And this is really what we're trying to gearing ourselves up for. Not the inevitability, but sort of getting there in terms of the response. So the area that we're talking about, we're not talking about reconstruction and resilience. We're talking about the relief and the recovery phases associated in the immediate response environment. This is the 6, maybe 8-week period immediately post-disaster. And there's a very good reason for that. It's associated both in terms of like the timescales that we have, the availability of time associated with this, and the way that we can leverage both commercial activity in terms of pro bono support in those resilience and response phases we've seen with some fantastic talks earlier on. But what we're talking about in the immediate response phase is something completely different. We do not have the time frame. So, post-disaster. This is, in essence, the simplicity of the model that we're looking at. It changes fundamentally a paradigm shift. What we used to have previously, and we still do now to a large degree, is humanitarian agencies, NGOs, having direct contact with individual firms. Those relationships work to a certain degree. But what we see is that we don't get that depth of support. We do not get that common platform of engagement that allows us to deploy speedily and with the appropriate level of support, so it's not just the person who's available. What this will do is have a single client entity, the demand, the section here, as a single client entity coming behind key humanitarian players, connecting between a large-scale network of firms that we've seen around the table today, through a common platform of engagement. The common platform of engagement is crucial associated with this, because of allowing that depth and speed of deployment. So, how does this work in essence? So what we have here, the client entity contacts directly the steering group of the hub. Now we have many, I'm hoping to see stage nods from around the room, of the steering group members that will be contacted directly from the client entity. This in turn has their own network that spins out to their own client, their own firms. The roster, in terms of the roster-based approach, is kept by that client entity. Each of those members on that roster having pre-deployment training with the ready to respond partners that we see in the room, which is mandatory associated with this. These are key steps forward. By then, as that network of technical people, the network of technical people defining the technical need. This is something where we find ourselves lacking at the moment. By putting that with a roster-based approach and just asking humanitarian players to try and define the technical need themselves, that's not what they're best placed at. By working in collaboration with a technical network, so that we can define the technical needs by technical people, we'll get the most appropriate people deployed at depth. And by having this network of different engineering organisations talking with each other, understanding the resource that is there in the field, this will allow that depth and scale of response. Now, crucially associated with this is the established contract relationship, the common platform of engagement. By understanding that pro bono doesn't really cut it in a disaster response environment, that you need to have the people at the moment with the highest level of skill sets deployed. The only way that it's going to be sustainable is if we recognise that there needs to be cost recovery associated with this. We're not talking about commercial rates. The cost of actually setting up the urban hub and running it is going to be met by all private sector firms. We're going to be doing that, but in order to make this a sustainable future associated with this, we have to recognise, like any other humanitarian professional, a cost recovery basis for those high-level people deployed in the field, and only across deployments as well. The establishment of this is something that we're looking at, trying to move forward now. So where are we now? We've now got an executive level buy-in from these players that we have around the table here, that now form part of the steering group associated with this. This is the urban hub that we've got, that represents a wide range of engineers. This buy-in at executive level, we now have to basically move that forward, engage further, engage wider, encourage more people to come into the process. The training method and protocols are being established through that network that we have in association with our Ready to Respond partners in terms of Red Arms. We're now part of the Global Alliance for Urban Crises. We're now getting around the table, being speaking about what it is that we as a network can bring to the table, how it is that we can actually empower the roster-based approach that has been, and is still being pushed forward. We're also working with IOM in the areas, oddly, outside of that immediate response 8-week period. Getting part of that, we're using part of our pro bono skills, that baton passing between the resilience into the response phases, and from the response phases into the recovery phases is something that we're acutely aware of as well. We now, and this is one of the reasons that we're here today, we're now looking at offering the opportunity to the humanitarian sector, engaging further. We need to now move forward. If we're going to make this work, if the engineering sector has got together and the private sector has got together now and established a model which we think works, but to take this forward and to make it really empowered and move it forward, we have to embrace and have to work together so that the humanitarian sector can actually help us shape really where we're going to be moving forward with this as we progress, and we will progress. And thank you very much. That's
really fascinating presentation. And I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of questions, comments, and I see hands already being raised. So we've now got, yeah, you were before time actually. You've given us extra time for discussion. So let me open the floor. I think the best way to do this is to take maybe 2 or 3 questions or comments at a time. If you could, is there a microphone or that can be passed around to people who want to speak? If you could identify yourself, your name and who you're working with, for the list of people who don't know you, that would be helpful. Thank you.
My name is Andrea Lai and I work for Integritas International Advisors. I have a question for the panel based on 2 points. Can you share with us your opinion in terms of the role of, I think, a missing category that you have not talked about, those survivors of the crisis. We know that the first responders are the local people, not the foreigners, not the external actors, not even the central government. So how would you factor the role of the first respondent into the hub and other experiences? And second, what are the principles, the mechanisms, the procedures that you are putting in place to make sure that the survivors and the local authorities and central authorities will be taken, will be involved into this process? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's going to be an interesting question to hear responses to. Anyone else? Marcus?
Yes, Marcus Kaiser, International Committee of the Red Cross. Yes, I definitely support the first question, yes, with regards to the local dimension. So I have another question then. It was, I mean, ICRC, bear with me, of course, we work in armed conflicts, so I would like to have your opinion about the various concepts, or even the hub that you intend on, actually you are actually going to found now, facing the reality of what many call the protracted conflicts that come and go. And I would probably slightly challenge one of the graphics, I think that in Jeff's presentation, where you had this rather static view of a rapid response and then a long-term, also long-term reconstruction phase. In many contexts, protracted conflicts, this kind of long-term reconstruction phase is very often derailed by sudden eruptions of violence. So how do you bring in this kind of more dynamic dimension of, again, protracted conflict?
Thank you, Marcus. Another good question. Should we take one more in this round, and then we'll have another round after we go back to the panel? come back to you, Richard, on the next round.
Thank you. My name is Diane Archer from IIT. Thank you for the very interesting presentations. My question revolves around the types of private sector organisations involved. I get the sense of mainly engineering firms. I wonder, is there any opportunity to bring in other types of private sector organisations, I don't know, communications, for example, or is there an opportunity for the companies that are already involved to bring in other private sector actors in each country context or response context?
Thank you, and a third good question. So let's go back to our panelists. Maybe we can start with Anne, just to see if she has any responses to any of those or any comments. Is she still on the line?
No, I think Anne's gone.
She's gone, okay. Well, let me go out. It's gone. Oh yeah, that's not it. Yeah, I mean that literally. Let's start with Jez actually, because a couple of the questions were direct. So Andreas was asking about the role of what he thinks is a missing category of the crisis survivors, first respondents. And then Marcus also about I suppose the applicability in protracted conflicts, given that the contexts are often not static and there isn't a linear kind of progression or improvement necessarily. And then thirdly, the issue of are other types of private sector actors, can they be included both in the hub, and we'll ask that to our other panelists. Thanks.
So starting at the beginning then, with the role of the survivors, the question that you talked about, I think there's several different approaches here. One is that you may have seen on one of the slides that we put up, the idea that within the hub network, we also have contacts which are local contacts associated with this. And this is key. The questions when in the earthquakes in Kathmandu, Joe Silver jumped on the line to me pretty much straight away. Now, Arup were able to deploy straight away, going out there. And we've been working on the Nepal Hospital Seismic Retrofit Program with John Sandy Associates, who are part of the surviving engineering group on the ground. So we share contact information and very quickly out there. So I think that there's this wider network, when we look across the world, and around the room, their network around the world and the international network that we're seeing with the technical people. Technical rather than engineers, because whilst they are all engineers on there, I do think there is a wider role in terms of this technical network. Defining, because we understand each other's speak and we understand each other's resources. So I think that by understanding those resources and sharing this trust between each other that we're developing by this network, then we can tap into those survivors and make sure that the surviving technical support, because it's necessary, you're absolutely right, to bring in the survivors into the recovery process. One of the pieces of work we've done already with the Urban Humanitarianism was the IOM, who asked us to throw in, I mentioned on the men's guide, and that was very specifically looking at the difficult position that is often faced by migrating refugees, where there isn't the technical support on the ground instantaneously, but somebody's got to make a decision. So we made a guide, a very rudimentary guide, very rough and ready, almost language-free, pictorial guide to give a rough ready reckoner associated to be an annex to going into this massive evacuation and natural disasters guide that we've made available to IOM, which is going to be distributed wider. So I think that we can help in terms of with the survivors, those who are forced to make technical decisions, if you like, without necessarily that technical depth of understanding that engineers would have. We can help in these environments. But I think, again, the only way that works because of engagement with IOM. So it's about communication. Is that, I think, in terms of answering that bit. That would be what I'd say on that. Now, I don't want to rattle on too long. Shall I tap?
In terms of private sector actors.
Yes, indeed. I gave this speech or this presentation in Learning Lessons from Tacloban in the Philippines, and the room was filled there with architects who were working with Article 25 as well. And one of the things that we've decided that we would do deliberately was to beta test it in a relatively small group. I mean, it's a strange thing to say, a relatively small group, when you see the depth of engineers that are around the table at the moment. But there was a reason for doing that, and it was largely so that we could thrash out some of these things in a tight forum. I think that we've now got 15 or so people in the steering group Arup from those engineering firms. But yes, absolutely, the intention is this is a technical network, and we're deliberately calling it that, because of the nature of we understand that urban planning, all of these issues have massive effects, those initial response phases. So absolutely, the intention is that we've created a model, albeit that it's one that needs to be tested further, but we're now inviting people to engage with, so please engage.
Darren, you want to hear the comments? Thank you.
I'll try and touch on a few of the different questions that were asked. To Andrea's question on the role of survivors, this is something that we really struggled with in this particular project, and we have kind of debates about internally, because for very real logistical reasons, as a private company, we tend to have resources in the country for very, very short periods of time. And so it's basically not possible to engage in those types of relationships to a large extent. It's very difficult to do that effectively and that's the makeup of the situation. We tend to rely very heavily on NGO partners, on public-private partners, and we're trying to grapple with that. But it is something that frustrates us, that is difficult to resolve. How do you build up that technical to technical? Yeah, fine. We can do that, but that's not the question you're asking.
No, it's about there are definitely plans, disaster risk reduction, scenario planning, there are lists of people.
Yeah.
So you may not have them, but you can access to the local authorities, other district, regional, central level.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be asking the questions. That's what we've got to do through each of those steps. To Marcus's question on protracted crisis, another thing we've struggled with internally, we're in the process of finishing a piece of work with IOM in Pakistan, and it's in response to flooding, which has been going on for years. There's no day zero. There isn't this kind of magical point. We've taken a similar approach to what we take in other contexts, which is that, again, from a technical perspective, a lot of this remains true. The problem remains constant. So how do you kind of deal with the solution as that goes on? One of the things we found in that situation is that the world of humanitarian development intervention has moved on as that crisis has developed. And one of the challenges has actually been trying to adapt, what our original scope was, what our original TORs were, which made sense 3 years ago, which maybe doesn't make sense today. And that's something that I think, in terms of literally the contractual relationship, needs to be engaged with on an ongoing basis, because the world does change. Even if the technical part of it may not, the implementation world does move on. The conflict side of it, that's not something that we've directly engaged in, and there's a simple insurance reason for that. It's not something that I commend the ICRC for being willing to do that, but it's not something that we as a company are able to do. We are currently self-financing a piece of research into coping mechanisms in homes, looking at how architects, urban planners and engineers and community groups in homes have been coping. That's simply out of our own interest and desire to try and be useful in some way, but it's very early days, and it's all being done by virtue of the fact that we have some Syrian staff who have those existing networks, but we can't send anybody there. So it's not a good answer, but 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 it's not a good answer.